Hi everyone, this is Jeff of Tau Fledermaus. Can you believe it's been 2 years since we've been using the Chronos 1.4 high-speed camera? Now I think it's safe to say in these 2 years, running this camera an average of 3 hours a week, we've got more time, more imagery, more use, more experience on this camera than probably any other user. Now rarely is this camera used indoors. It's mostly used for outdoor shots, and more often than not in pretty nasty conditions such as 105-degree ambient temperatures in the direct sunlight. Now since I first reviewed this camera, a lot has changed. There's been a lot of hardware revisions and software revisions. The boot up time now is 35 seconds. When we first reviewed it, it was almost 1 minute. Now we were one of the first people to get this camera, and it was still considered a prototype or a beta version at that time. Originally this camera had software version 1.0, and then it went to 1.1, 1.2, so on, and each revision added new features and not only improved the quality of the imagery but also added improvements to the user interface. We're now up to software version 3.0. A lot of the ideas for improved features and stuff like that come from Chronos users themselves, and much to my surprise they even use an idea that I suggested, something called abort save. And this feature allows you to stop the transfer of data from the RAM to the SD card for whatever reason. Now since our camera was a beta version with beta hardware, Chronos asked us to send the camera back. They pretty much gutted it, and the only thing that remains that is original is the aluminum case. Now before the upgrade, the imagery typically had a bluish tint to it. This was with the old sensor, and we also see a lot of dust specks on the imagery too. While some of it was probably dust on the sensor, a lot of it was just the old sensor had these artifacts on it. Now after the upgrades, we see big improvements. The colors are a lot more natural looking, and even in this higher resolution we don't see any of that the artifacts or the dust specks. Now the following imagery is just random stuff that I went out and filmed just to show you what it looks like now, and it just really stuns me how much of an improvement everything is. It just looks beautiful now. A lot of people pick my brain who are potential buyers of the camera, and they often ask me what kind of lenses I use. Now I use C-mount lenses, that's what the camera is designed for, and it also uses CS mount, which is basically the same threading and everything, but is designed to be mounted 5mm closer to the body. Now besides the mounting, another very important thing to look for is having an f-stop of 1.2. That gives you a very large aperture and allows you to run the camera in lower light. Now this lens is made in Japan by a company called Computar and is a zoom lens. It goes from 12.5mm up to 75mm for zoom. Now the focal range is from 1 meter up to infinity. Even though this is a zoom lens where you have to keep the subject at least 1 meter away to get it in focus, we can trick the camera into believing it's a macro lens by adding a 5mm adapter ring. So all we're doing is moving the lens 5mm further from the sensor and making it essentially nearsighted. Now I can set the camera inches away from the subject and film in macro mode. So let's take this opportunity and I'll show you how I film some. First we'll put a little more light on the subject. I'll start adjusting the f-stop and focus and zoom and all that. We can also adjust the exposure with that touch screen. And thank you, David, for making that button bigger. That was a big help. And once everything looks good, we can arm the camera. We can still make adjustments after we arm it, and we can also arm it and trigger it using that orange button on top. After we film the clip, we go to the play screen, and that shows us what we filmed. We have a slider there that shows us the entire 4-second clip, and then we can just mark out the part of the clip that we want to save. If you want to save the entire file, it'll take a lot longer, so just mark out the part that you really want to save, and it'll save rather quickly. Now, I might just be imagining things, but it seems like it saves the files a lot faster now. This is where it's going from the RAM into that SD card, and you can see that abort save button there. If we wanted to, you know, stop this process, we'd hit that abort save, and we could remark it, or, you know, maybe just film another clip, or whatever reason we needed to abort that save. But as you can see, it saved that file rather quickly, and that's important if you're out in the field, you know, filming a bunch of different clips. You don't want to be waiting forever for that camera to process that video and save it to the SD card, so it makes production much faster. And this is what the clip we just filmed looks like. It's filmed at 1500 frames a second with a flashlight. Not too bad, you know, for something I didn't really plan out or spend a lot of time doing. Now, the touchscreen display is awesome. It works really well, but when you're filming outdoors with bright sunlight, it can be difficult to see. Now, if you have a smartphone, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So if you're filming outdoors, you may want to make something like this. It's kind of a makeshift sunshade or a hood. This allows you to see the imagery a little better. I've even taken like a black t-shirt and draped it over the camera in my head to make adjustments, and that works pretty well too. It's kind of like the old-timey photographer with that, you know, he pulls that black hood over and he makes his adjustments. Same thing. The more time you spend making these little tweaks in focus, in zoom, in f-stop, and exposure, and all that stuff, the better it's going to look on screen ultimately, and the less, you know, post-editing you'll have to do. Now, to make adjustments to the frame rate, we go to record settings, and they've got a lot of presets, so, you know, different resolutions and different frame rates. The highest resolution the camera will do is 1280 by 1024, and that'll give us 1057 frames a second. Now, at 1280 by 720, that gives us 1502 frames a second. So the smaller the resolution, the higher the frame rate. It's all about how much data the camera can push into RAM. The data flow essentially stays the same, so if you make the resolution smaller, you have less data, but you can crank up the frame rate. Now, the camera will top out at over 38,000 frames a second, but it's a really small resolution. And it just becomes more and more challenging to get enough light, to get everything set up right, the faster you go with the camera. Now, it's very easy to get beautiful imagery with 1500 frames a second because you can start cranking down the f-stop, and it doesn't need as much light. You have longer exposure. It's just a piece of cake. But when you start cranking up to maybe 10,000 frames a second, that's where you need to really pay attention, have a lot of sunlight, and really take your time to get the focus right. The Chronos camera uses off-the-shelf Nikon style batteries, but I haven't even been using the Nikon brand batteries. I've been using these kind of no-name generic batteries, and these will give me about an hour and a quarter of run time. When they were new, it was about an hour and a half. I haven't really lost that much time in 2 years, so these have been holding up pretty well. The camera does have its own internal charging circuit. Just plug it in and it charges away, so you don't have to remove the battery to charge it. Now, instead of using some proprietary adapter, the Chronos just uses a 19-volt computer laptop adapter. David is a genius at keeping things simple and cheap. Now when I'm out in the field and I'm running the camera for 3 hours plus, I just plug this into my truck. It's a 140 watt inverter, and that's plenty of power to supply the camera. Now if you have multiple batteries and you want to charge the battery that's in the camera and the extra battery at the same time, well, you can pick up one of these chargers on eBay. I think I paid $12 for it, and now we can charge both of them at the same time. I almost hardly ever use this thing though. As I mentioned before, the camera uses just an SD card to store your files on. This one is a micro SD. I don't know why I'm using that, but it works. And this is a, you can look at the data of it and everything. This is a rather fast card, and it's 32 gigs, and you can put tons of files on that. I don't think I even use 5% of it every time we go out and film. So 32 gigs is a lot of storage. I think on average the file sizes are around 100 megs each. Now in the 2 years we've had this camera, we've put it to the test. We've been abusive to it, filming in the very hot conditions and foggy conditions, just nasty conditions for cameras, and it's performed very well. I wasn't sure when I got this how long this camera would last, to be honest with you. A lot of electronics have a short life, This thing is still very relevant. The guys at Chronos continue to have updates and improvements on this camera, so it's still very relevant and more relevant than ever. The camera's been knocked around, bumped around, the entire tripod with the camera on it has fallen over, and it's just held up extremely well. It's built like a tank. Now let's say you bought a camera and a couple weeks later it dies. Are you out of luck? No. There is something called infant mortality with electronics. A small percentage of electronics will just die early for some apparent reason. But the folks at Chronos will, cover you, make sure that you're satisfied and make repairs. I do know that Kevin from Backyard Science, his camera died on him. It was the only one I've heard of dying, in fact. But he sent it back, they made the repairs, and he's back in business again. And in the Chronos forums, I did see a conversation where a guy wanted to mount this on a laboratory, like a crash test dummy or something, and wanted to know if it would handle 16 Gs of deceleration, and David believed it would handle 16 Gs, and if it broke, well, he'd fix it. My experience with the camera has been fantastic. Also, the relationship between the customer and the company has been very good too. The camera is just under $3,000. Still a tremendous bargain for a high-speed camera with these capabilities. But anyway, enough of me talking. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching.